And the rewrite tonight is President Trump rewriting his position on guns.
Believe me, you put me in there, we're going to save that Second Amendment. We're going to save your guns. They're not going to take away your bullets. They're not going to shorten up your magazines. They're not going to do anything.
They're not going to do anything. The presidential candidate who said he would do absolutely nothing about gun laws had a meeting at the White House today about changing gun laws. It was a televised Trump meeting with a bipartisan group of senators and congressmen invited to the White House. And because it was a Trump meeting, it was filled with ridiculous Trump moments, like when he said he wanted to seize guns from some people before there's any proof that those people should have guns.
Number one, you can take the guns away immediately from people that you can adjudge easily are mentally ill, like this guy. You know, the police saw that he was a problem. They didn't take any guns away. Now, that could have been policing. I think they should have taken them away anyway, whether they had the right or not.
Take away the guns. Everyone in that room, Republicans and Democrats, knows that the president is an ignoramus. They know he does not comprehend a single sentence of the Constitution, but none of them tried to correct the president on that point, including the Democrats. The Democrats acknowledged leaders on gun legislation, Senator Dianne Feinstein of California and Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. The Democrats clearly made a calculation before the meeting started to approach the meeting professionally in the hope of actually getting something done. Any one of the Democrats could have become a big media star tonight by repeatedly explaining to the president how wrong he is, how ignorant he is, and how much of a problem he and his party have been for gun legislation. And so every Democrat in the room resisted the urge to attack the president for his own position on gun policy after all previous mass murders, because it was a meeting in which there was cause for some hope of strengthening background checks, which everyone in the meeting, including the president, seemed to be in favor of. And maybe there's hope for something more than that.
I'd just like to ask Joe and Pat, in your bill, what are you doing about the 18 to 21?
We don't change that.
Okay, are you going to leave that?
To everyone's surprise, it was the president who brought up banning the sale of assault weapons to buyers under the age of 21. He said it doesn't make sense to sell assault weapons to people under the age of 21, but he did not say he was actually opposed to it and was going to support legislation outlawing it. He mentioned that the NRA is opposed to that kind of legislation, but he said, quote, "It's something you have to think about." Now, most Trump watchers are probably betting that the NRA will keep Donald Trump in line and not allow him or the Republicans to do much more than a minor strengthening of background check system, if that. But Democrats in that room today had a responsibility to spend their time in that room working as legislators and not critics, because if they can help push through legislation, no matter how minor it is, it will be something where previously there has been absolutely nothing. And when they finish with that, those Democrats can go back to attacking the president for not doing more and go back. Joining us now, Josh Earnest, former White House press secretary for President Obama and an MSNBC political analyst. Current to the first round of anti-Kushner leaking from inside the Trump administration today, and then came the Washington Post report about the 4 countries that intelligence reports indicate have been discussing ways that they can manipulate Jared Kushner by taking advantage of his financial difficulties and his lack of foreign policy experience. Those 4 countries are the United Arab Emirates, China, Israel, and Mexico. The Washington Post article also contains the news that Jared Kushner's security clearance has been downgraded, and it attributes that information to, quote, administration officials. The Washington Post reports H.R. McMaster, President Trump's national security advisor, learned that Kushner had contacts with foreign officials that he did not coordinate through the National Security Council or official report. The issue of foreign officials talking about their meetings with Kushner and their perceptions of his vulnerabilities was a subject raised in McMaster's daily intelligence briefings, according to the current and former officials. These sources are obviously people who are bothered by what they are watching in the Trump White House press briefings and obviously believe that Jared Kushner does not deserve the protection of the White House in those briefings. They obviously believe that Jared Kushner should not be benefiting from White House official secrecy about security clearances. And so they tell the Washington Post things like this. Officials in the White House were concerned that Kushner was naive and being tricked in conversations with foreign officials, some of whom said they wanted to deal only with Kushner directly and not more experienced personnel, said one former White House official who might or might not be Steve Bannon or one of Jared Kushner's other detractors who is no longer working in the Trump White House. Could be Reince Priebus, could be Sean Spicer. It could be any one of at least a dozen people, maybe more, because the list of former Trump White House officials is the longest list of such a list in the history of a presidency that's only a year old. And it is a list full of very bitter backstabbers. And it might even include some people who are legitimately concerned about the way Jared Kushner operates in the Trump White House. Back to the Washington Post. Within the White House, Kushner's lack of government experience and his business debt were seen from the beginning of his tenure as potential points of leverage that foreign governments could use to influence him, the current and former officials said. They could also have legal implications. Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III has asked people about the protocols Kushner used when he set up conversations with foreign leaders, according to a former U.S. official. And needless to say, the special prosecutor's interest in Jared Kushner has to be the single scariest thing in Jared Kushner's life right now. Jared Kushner knows well the power of federal prosecutors. He knows that better than most people working in the Trump White House, because Jared Kushner spent 2 years of his life 2,182 miles per hour. That's how fast the bullets were moving when they came out of the barrel of that AR-15 in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School last week. 2,182 miles per hour, 3,200 feet per second. That's what those kids were trying to outrun. 3,200 feet per second. That's 3 times faster than the speed of a bullet leaving the barrel of a 9mm handgun. With a high-capacity magazine, the AR-15 can fire maybe 90 or 100 bullets in a minute. A concealable handgun can fire maybe 15 bullets in a minute. But President Trump said today that he believes if you put that concealable handgun in the hands of White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, he could have stopped the shooter in Florida last week. John Kelly could have gone into that school alone with no body armor and gone up against a mass murderer with an AR-15, and that would have been the end of it. John Kelly was in the room today when the president said that.
I'm watching John Kelly, General John Kelly. So he's a 4-star Marine. He's a tough cookie. If he was a teacher, man, I wouldn't mind having him have a gun, because I guarantee he can use it better than anybody. There's no security guard you're going to hire that's going to handle a gun better than him. So if he's a teacher, and if other friends of his from the Marine, if they're teaching, or other people like that, I want them to have a gun.
Well, that's certainly the kind of thing Clint Eastwood was doing in the movies when he was 67 years old. Going up against the bad guy with superior firepower and taking the guy out with his handgun. The president has seen too many Clint Eastwood movies. John Kelly is 67 years old. He has never gone into combat with only a handgun or commanded Marines in combat armed only with handguns. He has only commanded Marines in combat who have weapons of war, the finest weapons of war, like the AR-15. John Kelly would never order a Marine into combat armed with only a handgun. John Kelly was never trained to go into combat in an American high school where the possible collateral damage included high school students, thousands of them, and dozens of American high school teachers. No Marine has ever been trained to do that, and no Marine has ever done it. But in Donald Trump's imagining of mass murder in an American school, All it takes to stop the shooter is a former Marine with a concealable handgun, and he seems convinced that former Marines and other military veterans have filled American teaching jobs.
You have teachers that are Marines for 20 years and they retire, they become a teacher, and they're Army, Navy, Air Force, they're Coast Guard, they're people that have won shooting contests.
No, that's not what people do when they retire from the military. No one appears to be keeping a close count of the number of Marines or other veterans who become school teachers, but it is a tiny, tiny percentage of teachers. It could be below 3%, possibly below or around 1% of teachers. Donald Trump seems to think it's 40%.
They're not going to walk into a school if 20% of the teachers have guns. It may be 10% or maybe 40%.
And we were stunned. Stunned to discover that every word John Kelly said there about Congresswoman Wilson and President Obama was untrue. John Kelly never apologized to President Obama for shoehorning him into that lie about the Congresswoman. He never apologized to President Obama for inventing a story about a phone call that he said the president participated in. He never tried to clarify that there was no racist intent in his lies, and refused to apologize to the black president and the black Congresswoman, the only member of Congress he has publicly attacked and lied about. And John Kelly now pretends that it breaks his heart that on the 104th day after he lied about Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, that she decided not to attend the State of the Union address delivered by a president who has been caught by the Washington Post in literally thousands of documented lies in his first year as president. We know what John Kelly looks like when he's lying. We have known that since the day he so angrily talked about Congresswoman Wilson. He looks very comfortable. He looks very confident when he's lying. He looks very committed to those lies. And he can even sound very reasonable when he's lying about what he says breaks his heart, like Congresswoman Wilson boycotting the State of the Union address. In that same interview yesterday, John Kelly demonstrated an ignorance of White House history that is a perfect fit to the Trump presidency, and a willingness to say anything to help the president crush the investigation of the president.
Rod Rosenstein and the FBI Director Wray don't want you to release the memo. Will you guys?
The memo, 4 pages, came over day before yesterday.
Right.
The unique thing about all of this, frankly, is in every other case that I can remember in my lifetime where a president was in some kind of trouble, the president, the White House attempted to not release things. Whether it was Iran-Contra, but certainly things like the Nixon years. This president has said from the beginning, and certainly since I've been the chief of staff for 6 months now, I want everything out. I want this thing. I want the American people, A, to know the truth, and B, that the investigators and whatnot have everything. It's really unique in that we've leaned so far forward to get this out. Now, as far as the memo goes, the memo came over. We've got our folks our national security lawyers in the White House that work for me, work for the president. They're slicing and dicing it, looking at it so that we know what it means and what it understands.
Did you see it?
I did.
What do you think?
It'll be released here pretty quick, I think, and the whole world can see it.
John Kelly said there were White House lawyers looking at the memo, slicing and dicing it, and then in the next second.
So let's assume the worst case scenario for the moment for Trump. Oh, good. No applause this time.
You've worn them down.
I had to find the right wording, the most anodyne wording I could find. Anyway, I think what will happen is, and this could happen as soon as 24 hours from now if Roy Moore loses. There'll be a lot of premature, I feel, victory celebrations among Democrats and liberals saying, you know, the Wicked Witch is dead. Just like when Goldwater, it was like I remember that, you know, even as a kid, it was such a sigh of relief because he was going to bring about nuclear Armageddon. He was against the Civil Rights Act. So here we have Trump, who of course now makes Goldwater look like Disraeli, or Churchill. But it seems to me that the Democrats were self-deceiving in '68. They were self-deceiving in '64, and perhaps again after the success of Barack Obama. And I still feel that the fractured Democratic Party that you describe in your book is very much still fractured, whereas the Republican Party that was emerging in your book has been pretty consistent since then and remains consistent even if Trump disappears, because while he's the worst case scenario of it, he's capitalizing on everything we've seen from Sarah Palin and the Southern strategy, Reagan, and everything else. So what's your sort of global view of it all, do you think?
Well,
the two parties?
That is the one guarantee we have, is that after what is perceived as a big loss in a presidential campaign, or now even a close loss in a presidential campaign, it is the news media exclusively that comes up with, and pundits exclusively, that come up with this notion that that's the death of the Democratic Party, that's the death of the Republican Party. And there was a lot of that talk in 1968, and that's after Hubert Humphrey lost by less than 1% of the vote, and Hubert Humphrey was an extremely weak candidate. And so it's just always been wrong. Every time a party has been declared in disarray and hopeless, it has always been wrong. I can remember vividly the cover stories about the permanent majority that Karl Rove was creating from his perch in the first term of the Bush administration. And Karl Rove was the media's absolute darling as the greatest genius who'd ever lived on the Republican side of our politics. Incomparable elevation to genius status. And Rove, I don't fault him. He was spinning everyone as best he could. That's what he was supposed to do. But that turned out to be wrong. And, one of the things that I've really been glad about with this book is that reviews and reactions have not been partisan. And I'm going to share one that I got privately today, and I hope it's okay with him. I got a little, and it's because there's a wonderful piece of wisdom in it that's directly related to this question, and I wasn't going to do it. But I got a really warm email from George Will this morning about the book. And one of the things he said about it was that this shows, it's yet another demonstration of how much anger and alienation the major parties can absorb. And that was his word, absorb. And I actually hadn't really concentrated on that as I was writing the book. It's one of those lessons that comes out of the evidence as presented without me ever making that argument. And I love that George saw something, a case to be made that I hadn't specifically made, but it's absolutely there, because when you look at what happens to that Democratic Party in 1968, it is inconceivable that these people will ever even talk to each other again. Never mind unite around anything in the future. And you start to think that other parties could grow. And George's point in the email was, in other countries, when these kinds of devastating disasters happen to parties, they start to splinter off into new parties and create new parties. And this Democratic Party, this Republican Party, they can absorb and endure anything. And they're still going to be sitting there in contention the next time around.
I mean, what we've seen with the Republicans, I think, under Trump is it was all nonsense that there was this establishment Republican group that was different from the party that he was appealing to. His base is the party. They've accepted everything from beginning with insulting McCain onward to, sexual harassment, endorsing a pedophile. So that is the Republican Party. It seems to me that John Anderson died in the past week. That kind of independent if John Kasich and these people, they really have nowhere to go unless they started a likely doomed splinter party, right? I mean,
and Norm Ornstein, who is a nonpartisan analyst of these things, and I want to cite him because I'm not.
He's great.
I am not, for some reason, perceived as nonpartisan. I don't know. It must be something I've said. I don't know what it is. he makes the case that these two parties are no longer comparable. You can't say they both do the same thing, and that one of them has gone completely out of control in a direction of irresponsibility and no need to base their arguments, their positions, or their policies in fact. And that is a new world order for a political party. And so, this is something we've never seen before, going off into this Earth is flat environment. But it's not working. 60% of the country vociferously disapproves of Donald Trump as president, and then there are plenty of people who are in the positive Trump side of those polls who don't like him. It is not hard when you go out there and talk to Trump voters who will tell you they think he's an idiot, they think he's an embarrassment, they think all of these things, but they also think abortion is murder. And so there's only one vote for them. It must be the Republican, and it must be Roy Moore in the case of Alabama, for example. And so, and there are others who just say all they care about is that they want lower taxes and they don't care who says that. And I certainly the Trump voters that I know in Massachusetts, which is not exactly the same thing as the Alabama Trump voter, I haven't met one of them who doesn't think Trump is a buffoon. But they want lower taxes or they're anti-abortion, and that's where their vote is.
Right, and cynically, there are people like Gary Cohn in his administration, or Stephen Schwartzman, the New York financier, who support Trump and are probably pro-choice about abortion, but cynically want their
all the Trump memoirs, all the Trump administration memoirs are going to be competing with what phrase do I come up with to outdo Rex Tillerson on
moron.
Fucking moron.
Let's talk for a second about that third of the country that is unwavering in support of Trump, has been, and in my mind, you can trace it back to *68. It's sort of the Wallace vote. It's the vote that supported Nixon after his reelection and through much of Watergate. That's 32 or 33% of the vote. After Hillary Clinton lost, there have been a lot of sort of breastfeeding among liberals that, we've all read Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy. The Democrats have to go and talk to these Trump voters and convince them they don't give a damn what any Democrat's going to say. They're going to watch Breitbart and Fox. They're not going to watch you. They're not going to read, liberal publications like the ones I've worked for. And that, to me, though, is an indicator of how lost the Democrats are, that they think this stable group, a minority of the country, 1/3 of the country, can be converted, because I think that's sort of a wasted effort.
Well, again, that's mostly a columnist and pundit exercise. I haven't watched too many Democrats going out there and trying to do it. There are Democrats in states like West Virginia, like Joe Manchin, who has to do it every day.
Right.
He has to be able to talk to both of those sides every day. And the Democratic Party used to have those senators in Georgia as recently as when I was working in the Senate, Georgia, Alabama. Here's how it feels to me, like it wasn't that long ago, but when I was working in the Senate, both of the Alabama senators were Democrats, including, by the way, the current senior Republican senator from Alabama. He was a Democrat when I was working in the Senate. He switched parties after the election of 1994 when the Democrats got wiped out. Look, I don't think there is a conversion policy that you can come up with and put in a 30-second TV ad in politics. And I don't think there's something a politician can say to convert what's left of the Trump support base. They probably aren't going to move, or they're going to move over a very slow period of time that you can't use in politics. And by that I mean segregationists in 1960 were not segregationists in 1970. I mean, some of them still had their heart there, but some of them didn't. Some of them genuinely changed their minds. There were pro-war pro-Vietnam War people in 1964 who were anti-Vietnam War in 1968, including, by the way, United States senators, because Gene McCarthy and all the rest of them, except for one, voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that allowed for the escalation of the Vietnam War. A bunch of them changed their minds in a number of years, but they didn't do it overnight, and they were reluctant to change their minds. So people do change their minds, but within the political window that you need them to change their minds on things like attachment to Donald Trump, 4 years is usually too short a window to get that to happen. But there's always hope in the longer term. And I can never let go of that because of an experience I had right here in New York City back in the early 90s with Senator Moynihan. He was doing the Today Show one morning. And the Russian ambassador to the UN was also doing the Today Show for reasons I can't remember at the time. And this used to be, this Senator Moynihan, of course, was the ambassador to the UN when it was the Soviet delegation. Soviet Union has since collapsed. The Berlin Wall has come down. And now here is the Russian ambassador to the United Nations over there in the corner of the green room with his gang, I think I can use the word, because Pat Moynihan was sitting with me in a corner saying, I think that one's KGB and I think that one's KGB, because he's recognizing some of the faces in that group who he believed were KGB agents back when they were in the Soviet delegation. And so Pat Moynihan has to go on first and do his segment. And so we're getting up to leave the room and we're walking out of the room. And the guy who he had fingered first of all as a KGB agent, the toughest looking one of all of them, comes running up to Senator Moynihan as he's going out the door to go do his segment. And he says something in heavily accented English that neither one of us can understand. And then he says it a second time, and we hear a couple of the words of it, but we haven't put it all together. And then the third time he says it, Pat Moynihan's face lights up like I'd never seen it before, because what he's saying, looking up at Senator Moynihan with this big smile, is we were listening. And in that instant, Senator Moynihan's life was rewarded because he had lived a life of hoping that you were listening. As his students in lecture audiences at Harvard, he was hoping you were listening in the United Nations, but he never really expected you were. He was hoping you were listening on the floor of the United States Senate, but he never really expected that you were. And it turned out that the most important listening that he could ever have been validated on was by the people who actually were on the other side of that Berlin Wall, the other side of that Cold War, which ended without a shot being fired because, among a bunch of other forces, they were listening. They were listening to a condemnation of the Soviet Union by this American ambassador every time he talked about them in the United Nations, and they were still able to very slowly, over time, process it. And so pessimism has no business living in a world with that story.
Well, that's encouraging. In writing the book, what were the things that you've forgotten that you rediscovered, or what were the surprises, if any, as you looked at this year again and all this material and sifted it through your grown-up self? What were the things you didn't expect that hit you? Well,
I was an uncompromising anti-war idealist in high school and college, and so I never saw gray areas. And there's nothing makes you understand the gray better than going to work in the United States Senate. And so I worked there for close to 8 years, and I see it all so differently now, and I have a whole set of sympathies that are different, and just genuine understandings. I mean, I was one of those people who, because my brother Kevin had gotten clean for Gene and shaved the beard,
clean for Gene,
and cut the hair and gone up to New Hampshire to help with the McCarthy campaign, and McCarthy was the first anti-war candidate, so I was with McCarthy, but then highly conflicted when Bobby Kennedy got in as a Boston Irish Catholic kid. They were our heroes. And yet the Bobby thing seemed opportunistic to me, and I was bothered by it. And now I understand, which I didn't know, that Bobby was thinking about running long before Gene McCarthy. And the people who were begging Gene McCarthy to run had already been begging Bobby to run. I didn't understand any of those dynamics. It also I was not thinking in 1968 that Bobby Kennedy is the only person in American history, until Teddy then does it years later. But at that point, the only person in American history whose decision to run for president has to include a calculus about what is the likelihood of a copycat assassin wanting to get the next Kennedy on his way to the presidency. And I wasn't thinking about that when I was watching what was happening in 1968. And so there's all sorts of personal dimensions of the men and the women involved, like Abigail McCarthy, Gene McCarthy's wife, who is just the most astonishingly wonderful character I could have come across in writing about this. It's mostly in there. It's mostly in who these people are, who they were, what they were thinking. The fact that Jackie Kennedy wrote the most poignant and important passage in what was Bobby Kennedy's 1964 convention speech, the speech for which he got a 22-minute ovation before he spoke a word. And then Jackie's own personal prediction that when Bobby started running for president, which she supported, she privately told a confidant that she thought that what was going to happen to Bobby was the same thing that happened to Jack. It's all of that. It's this amazing backstage experience that you get to have in this story. And that's what I care about the most, because I have to say, having lived backstage in government and politics, I care virtually nothing about what happens on the stage. I mean, the worst night of the year for me is the State of the Union address. For whoever's giving it, you know, where I have to pretend something important has just happened in a speech. And yeah, I have to tell you, inside government and politics, there's no one is held in lower regard than the speech writers, because the people who actually do the governing think the speech making is the silly part of it, and it's the oversimplification and the cheerleading part of it. And so my own attraction is always to what was going on in the room where the doors closed.
You know, if I may say so, a positive thing about Trump's campaign was that he did.
I didn't hear any applause for that.
Was that he did, in his crude sort of bull in a china shop way, completely demolish a lot of the conventions and stagecraft of American politics. You know, he didn't have good TV ads. He didn't listen to consultants. He ridiculed polling. He showed that, you know, and whether it was for Hillary Clinton or on the Republican side, Jeb Bush, they were blindsided by this kind of breaking. They all believed in these rules. They believed you had to listen to consultants. You had to stage events that were as silly as the State of the Union. And I don't think it's ever going to be the same again now.
Well, but so the reason Trump was able to do that, you can throw away, you can break the rules as long as you have one thing driving your candidacy. The only thing that allows you to break rules when it's driving your candidacy is hatred. And Trump's campaign was a hate-fueled campaign from the start. So if you hate what I hate, you can do no wrong. That is the strongest connection you can have to voters. And we've seen versions of that on the Democratic side, and we saw it in 1968. It is impossible. I think Frank will agree to this. It's impossible to overstate how much Lyndon Johnson was hated by the kids who went to New Hampshire to campaign for Gene McCarthy. Hated him. He was a personal threat to their own lives in him sending them off to Vietnam. He was despised. Richard Nixon was then despised. So much of the energy for Gene McCarthy and the could do no wrong in '68 came from this hatred, which we could call a virtuous hatred because it was aimed for this other good. And Gene McCarthy could do things as a candidate that no one else dared to do. He would stand up in front of audiences and, as far as the press was concerned, bore them to death. They couldn't believe how flat and boring some of these speeches were, and the McCarthy kids loved every second of it. They didn't need to cheer and applaud, you know, for every line. McCarthy was the very last presidential candidate ever who believed that the way to win hearts and minds and votes was to flatter the audience's intelligence. and he would do things like quote the most obscure poetry off the top of his head, and no one knew what he was talking about. But he could violate all those, you know, new rules about how dynamic and charismatic you were and simple-minded you were supposed to be on the campaign stage, because he had this incredible power behind him, which was a hatred of the current regime and a hatred of the war in Vietnam. And so there is just nothing like hatred pushing a candidacy forward, because hatred includes 100% forgiveness for anything you do, as long as you're hating what I hate.
You know, I grew up, as I suspect you did, in a household that hated Nixon. But people forget the visceral hatred that Johnson, after these triumphs of the Civil Rights Act and all the rest of it, piled up, and when there was all this hoo-ha over the summer about the Shakespeare in the Park, Julius Caesar, where Trump was, assassinated. At least someone who looked like Trump. People forget that the most successful off-Broadway play of the late '60s was a play called McBird, where Lyndon Johnson was literally accused of having contrived the assassination of JFK, and it ran for 12 months, 13 months, and anyway, so some very red meat questions.
Oh, good.
What happens if Trump fires Mueller?
Well, I don't know. I will say it's too late. The time to do that has passed because Manafort's already indicted. He's under indictment. There's a case number in a federal court in Washington. That case doesn't go away. Nothing makes it go away. The president cannot make that case go away. Now, if the president decides, I really do want to fire Mueller and make the case go away, okay, then you can pardon Manafort, but you've got a problem when you pardon Manafort. That just means that Manafort has to testify to Congress under oath publicly the next day, because once you're pardoned, you lose your Fifth Amendment rights, because you cannot self-incriminate over something you've been pardoned for. So he has no Fifth Amendment rights the minute you pardon him. He also is still liable for any crime of perjury he might commit while under oath. So everything about, and this has all been explained to an extremely depressed Donald Trump. When he was hearing this, he was going, imagine when you tell him, oh yeah, the problem with the pardon is he loses his Fifth Amendment rights, then he can say everything publicly tomorrow. Imagine Trump's reaction to that when the lawyers told him that. So it's gone too far down the road to be able to extricate. Same thing, but with Flynn, by the way. If you wanted to just pardon Flynn tomorrow, you could, but that makes him an available witness the next day under oath publicly to the committees. And so, it's a little too far down the road for Trump to be able to do any of this stuff effectively. But that's a long-winded answer to I don't know what happens, other than, you may open up some of these guys to be witnesses immediately if you also accompany it all with a pardon.
Here's a three-part question. I really like the first part. When do you think Trump will be indicted? Not if, just when.
Yeah.
And parts 2 and 3 are, do you think Jared and Don Jr. will be indicted, and will the indictments exceed the number of Nixons?
Yeah. It's hard. Nixon, it was over 40. Just in the Nixon administration. That doesn't count the burglars. It's hard to outdo Nixon. 2 Nixon attorneys general. That's hard to outdo. I don't think they're going to be able to outdo the Nixon administration. I have no idea, and I have no idea what the liability for Jared Kushner is all within that. That's the liability we know about is within the disclosure forms where he did not disclose things about his foreign contacts. And so he definitely has some criminal liability there. We'll see if it meets the threshold of a prosecution. I don't know. Donald Trump has obvious criminal liability on obstruction of justice for firing Comey and his stated reasons for firing Comey, and then his absolutely brilliant tweet. Just the most wonderful confessional tweet in history. We have a winner. We have a winner for stupidest tweet in history. And it's Donald Trump saying, when I, fired Flynn, I knew he had lied to the FBI. All this, fired Comey, all that stuff. It's he's just a miracle. The prosecutors are staring at that, saying, we've never, ever, ever had anybody like this who just serves up this stuff to us. And so, he has real exposure there. That's where I think, in terms of just the public record, I have no idea what his exposure is on, Russian entanglements. I have no idea what that might be. That's all guesswork at this stage. But, the Comey thing and that firing is a very clear place to explore obstruction of justice. But, I don't know if any of that stuff's going to. I'm very patient about waiting for these things to happen. And I don't know if that's. I guess I've learned that a few ways over time, but there's nothing like actually working in the Senate for developing your patience for stuff, for outcomes,
Do you think, indictments aside, do you think Trump lasts a full term?
Well, without indictments or an impeachment move, I don't see what else would do it. Clearly, you know, the 25th Amendment is there. It's been put there for you to remove a president who's out of his mind, among other things. And it has to be activated by the vice president. The vice president has to personally activate the 25th Amendment by convening a majority of the cabinet to sign a document saying the president is incapable of fulfilling his duties. Mike Pence hasn't seen enough evidence yet. So I wouldn't hold my breath on the 25th Amendment. Well, that leaves impeachment.
Well, one other possibility that occurred to me, but feel free to knock it down. What if Donald Jr. and Jared are in real legal trouble, and there's some deal Trump could make to sort of save them and also possibly Trump businesses and get out while declaring victory?
Well, here's the thing. No one has ever been able to plea bargain impeachment because it's not a courtroom thing. This is the strength of it, and jurisprudentially, in a certain kind of way, the weakness of it. And we discovered this in the Clinton impeachment because I was no longer working in the Senate, but I was talking to Senator Moynihan about it a lot and seeing him a lot. And we all believed that there was this thing, you know, called high crimes and misdemeanor, that there was a legal definition of what this is, of what impeachable is. And the longer we stared at the histories of impeachment, which are mostly of federal judges, it's exactly the same process, we realized impeachment is whatever the House of Representatives and the United States Senate say it is. It can be for anything. And the reason for that is that there is no judicial review of impeachment. You know, you cannot appeal the impeachment verdict of the Senate to the Supreme Court. And remember, the founders could have allowed for that. They easily could have. They didn't. They made sure there's no appeal to the decision made by a political entity. And so they made impeachment political. And so, you know, we don't know what might be the impeachable argument in this case, but a prosecutor cannot possibly make a deal with you on behalf of the House of Representatives who operate in a completely different way. Everything you just said, a prosecutor could make a deal with anyone in the private sector, like Mike Flynn, for example, saying, here's our deal, and you plead guilty, and we're not going to touch your son, which apparently at this point in time might be part of the Flynn deal. The son has no legal jeopardy that we know of with the special prosecutor. Everything Frank described, a prosecutor could do with a defendant as long as this was all being done within the court system alone. But I don't know what that method is that allows you to make these kinds of deals. And it's a very tricky thing to figure out how Trump could plead out with Mueller in a way that protects his son and son-in-law. I don't know how to do it.
My only theory, and like you, I didn't go to law school and couldn't have gone to law school, is that it would not be about counts of impeachment per se from Congress, but it would be a political move, that there'd be indictments of family members, and maybe Mueller would give a report to Congress that would somehow speed the way for Trump to declare victory and go home. That's my half-assed,
But just in that scenario, the special prosecutor has to suddenly become political. Okay, so let's just assume that the special prosecutor gets an indictment against Jared Kushner, an indictment against Donald Trump Jr., someone Donald Trump cares about a lot. And Donald Trump then says to the special prosecutor, I will resign the presidency if you drop those indictments. The special prosecutor is making a deal outside of the court system that is a political deal, and I don't know how Mueller would find his way to knowing how to make that deal.
Well, maybe he'll just...
We could go on and on about this.
Maybe he'll just...
We could do an hour on this. There's a lot of games.
We could really just factor in the 12 cans of Diet Coke a day. But last question here. If you were interviewing one of the participants of the 1968 campaign, to whom would you give the last word?
You know, I would give it to the person who gets the last word in the book, which is Gene McCarthy, because he's the one who started everything that gave us what became the 1968 campaign. If Gene McCarthy had not decided to run, Bobby Kennedy would not have run. Bobby thought about it before Gene, decided against it, thought about it again, decided against it, and then Gene does it. And then Gene does very well in New Hampshire. Bobby had already been thinking about it again because he saw McCarthy's poll numbers going up in New Hampshire. And Bobby jumped in. And part of Bobby's jumping in was the belief that Gene McCarthy wouldn't be able to take this to the finish line, which is a belief that I now share. I didn't share it at the time, but I do share it now. There were a lot of defects in McCarthy as a dedicated campaigner that I don't think he could have made it. And Bobby could have. So Bobby wouldn't have run. The election would have been Lyndon Johnson versus Richard Nixon. Lyndon Johnson probably would have won that. And we would have seen Vietnam go on in a very similar way to the way it went on with Nixon. And then Bobby Kennedy would have been, very likely, the Democratic nominee anti-war candidate in 1972 because he would not have been assassinated, because he wouldn't have been in California on the night of the California primary. So Gene McCarthy, the poet, who decides to run for president, is a dramatist's dream. This is the most unlikely possible person. Bobby Kennedy was shocked to hear that Gene McCarthy had decided to run for president. Gene McCarthy didn't just read poetry, he wrote poetry, sitting in his Senate hideaway office when other senators thought he should be working. He would be writing poetry. He was the most intellectually removed and in many ways possibly the most intellectually sophisticated member of the United States Senate at the time. He was simply the most unlikely person. And what hit him was a moment of moral outrage in, of all things, a Foreign Relations Committee hearing when he heard Nicholas Katzenbach say that the administration believed that declarations of war were outmoded. And Gene McCarthy was outraged by that, and that's the moment where he said privately to his chief of staff that we've got to put the Vietnam War on the presidential ballot, and if I have to run for president to do it, I'll do it. And that's the decision that gives us everything that happened in 1968. The Republican side of the politics was going to be the same, no matter what Gene McCarthy did. Nixon was going to be that nominee. That worked all very smoothly. But it's McCarthy who created that year. It's McCarthy who created a hope in politics that the kids supporting McCarthy did not have before he emerged. And it was McCarthy who really gave us all the dynamics that we saw in that year. And ultimately, what Gene McCarthy did saved lives, because the last man to die for the mistake that was the Vietnam War was April 29th, 1975. If the first anti-war candidate had not run until 1972, that war would not have ended in 1975. We don't know how many more years it would have gone on, but it would have gone on. And so Gene McCarthy got the draft stopped, in effect, by the protest that was unleashed in the anti-war movement. The draft was stopped in January of 1973. That draft wasn't going to stop in January of 1973 if Gene McCarthy hadn't run in 1968. And so he is the person to whom we owe, first of all, a vibrant and strong and effective anti-war movement in our politics where the war could actually get on a presidential ballot. No one thought that was possible. He's the one who thought that was possible. And he gave us that year, including some of one of the most horrible things that you can imagine happening in that year, which was the loss of Bobby Kennedy. All of that happened because of this impulsive and principled and outraged decision made by the most unlikely person who could possibly have made that decision.
I encourage everyone here to read Playing with Fire and learn more about this. Congratulations to you. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you very much.